This video provides general guidelines for the installation of fiberglass reinforced plastic above ground oil tanks. Throughout this video, we'll also refer to these as FRP tanks. NORA recommends that the specific instructions of the tank manufacturer and all applicable codes and regulations be diligently followed when installing any oil heat equipment. Professional tank installations start well before the tank arrives at the job site. By the time the installer arrives to put in the tank, all of the following should have taken place. A company representative has visited the site to explain all of the options that are available, especially the advantages of inside installations. Choosing the right tank and the best location are important decisions, and the customer should be fully informed when making them. It's critical to verify that the new tank will fit into the designated installation area and that a suitable, solid, and stable foundation is present, such as a poured concrete floor. The installation area should also be checked to ensure that all applicable regulations can be met and that oil delivery can be safely made. Before the installation takes place, all necessary permits should be secured, and the customer's new tank must be received, inspected, and approved. Most importantly, the installers must thoroughly familiarize themselves with the current version of the manufacturer's instructions for the specific tank they will be installing. The installation crew's job begins when they inspect the tank before loading it onto their vehicle. If any water has accumulated inside the tank, it should be drained at this time. A close visual inspection should follow to determine if there is any unacceptable damage. Unacceptable damage is defined as bruises, impact cracks, or deep scratches extending below the exterior coating of the tank. Once they are satisfied that the tank is undamaged, they can carry it to their vehicle using the tank's integral handles. Tanks should never be dragged or walked. Once in the vehicle, the tank should be protected and secured to avoid damage during transport. Before heading for the job site, the crew should make sure that they have all necessary equipment and the correct materials in sufficient quantities for the installation. Fill and vent pipes are typically Schedule 40 steel pipe connected with malleable fittings. Cast fittings used in steam systems can be easily broken and must not be used when piping oil tanks. PVC and copper piping should never be used for fill or vent piping of oil tanks. In addition to the steel pipe, the crew will need coated copper tubing for the oil supply line, secondary containment if required, a vent alarm, a tank gauge, vent, and fill caps. Also needed are cement, caulking, pipe joint compound, and assorted fittings, nipples, valves, and plugs. Installations vary depending on whether the tank is installed indoors or outdoors. Let's look at an inside installation first. When the crew arrives at the job site, they should check the areas the tank will have to be moved through, as well as the installation site itself. Before moving in the new tank, it's critical to double-check to make sure that the tank will fit and be in compliance with applicable codes. Keep in mind that the tank must be installed on a flat, level, and stable surface, away from heat sources. Once the crew is satisfied that the installation can proceed as planned, the tank should be carefully removed from the truck and again inspected to be sure that no damage occurred during transportation. Tank testing should now be conducted. This illustration shows the test of a double-walled FRP tank. First, we'll test the integrity of the primary tank. Begin by capping off all the piping connections that aren't being used for the test. Install test equipment consisting of a flow control valve, a 0 to 15 psi pressure gauge, a shutoff valve, an interstitial space test gauge, and a flexible air line connecting the shutoff valve to the vent for the interstitial space, that is, the space between the two tank walls. To begin the test, make sure the shutoff valve is closed to isolate the interstitial space. Pressurize the primary tank to a maximum of 5 psi by opening the control valve. When the pressure reaches 5 psi, close the control valve and remove the pressure source. Apply a 40:1 solution of water and dishwashing liquid to all the plugged connections. If continuous bubbling is observed at any of the plugged connections, carefully tighten the plug until no more bubbles are observed. If a decline in pressure is observed, or if the interstitial space gauge reads pressure, stop the installation and have your supervisor contact the tank manufacturer. If the pressure holds, the primary tank has passed its test. Following the test of the primary tank, it is critical to test the integrity of the interstitial space. Again, that's the space between the walls of a double-walled tank. Begin this test by opening the shutoff valve and allowing the air from the primary tank to pressurize the interstitial space. Again, apply the soap solution to all threaded connections and tighten as required if bubbling occurs. Observe the interstitial space pressure gauge for a period of 30 minutes, and if there is a decline in pressure, notify your supervisor and await instructions before proceeding with the installation. If the pressure holds, the installation can proceed. Use this testing time to collect and inspect all fittings and accessories necessary to complete the installation. The work area and any living areas that the crew will be traveling through should be protected to avoid damage and simplify cleanup. In case there's an unforeseen problem, it's advisable to bring the new tank to the installation area before beginning to remove the old one. If there's not enough room for both tanks, measurements and clearances should again be checked to ensure that the new tank will fit and can be properly piped. Before the old tank is disconnected, the tank valve should be closed, the heating system should be turned off, and any oil remaining in the old tank should be removed and properly disposed of. Pump overs should be avoided. The oil lines, fill, and vent pipes should be disconnected, safely drained, and properly disposed of. NORA recommends that old oil lines should never be reused with a new tank. Once the old tank is empty and all attached piping has been disconnected, all tapping should be plugged. The tank should then be wrapped in plastic or other protective material to prevent damage to the customer's property as it is removed from the premises for proper disposal. To begin the installation of the new tank, the installers should clean the area to clear away any debris. The new tank should then be carefully brought to an upright position and set in place, so that the tank label will be clearly visible after installation is complete. Although corrosion from accumulated water is not a factor with FRP tanks, it is still good practice and often a code requirement to slope the tank toward the outlet end. Before beginning to pipe the tank, the installers must verify that it is at least 5 feet from any heat source, and at least 2 inches from any walls or obstructions to allow for service and inspections. Start tank piping by removing all shipping plugs and determining which openings will be used for the fill, vent, oil lines, and tank gauge. Double-walled FRP tanks also require venting of the space between the 2 tank walls, so this tapping should be identified. All piping must be tightly connected using pipe joint compound and properly aligned with its connection to the tank. Next, a vent alarm should be installed into the tank. The fill and vent pipes should be constructed using swing joints to provide a minimum of 1% downward pitch toward the tank to avoid traps. The new pipes are run to the outside of the premises, where they should terminate close to the building with the proper fittings and caps. Remember, double-walled FRP tanks have the additional requirement to vent the space between the 2 tank walls to the atmosphere. Follow the manufacturer's instructions for installing another vent line to the outside. Note that the fill point should be at least 3 feet above ground level. The vent should be positioned next to and 6 inches higher than the fill pipe. Both should be a minimum of 2 feet from any building openings and at least 5 feet from any flue gas outlet or appliance air inlet. Once the fill and vent piping have been completed, caulking or cement should be applied to the inside and outside areas where the pipes pass through the wall. If a combination vent alarm and gauge has not been installed, a fuel level gauge should now be installed into the tank. At this time, any unused tapping should be properly plugged using pipe joint compound. For the sake of efficiency, this is the time to call for a delivery, as the tank is now ready to accept oil. If no delivery is planned when the tank is installed, the fill pipe should be tagged with a notice indicating that the tank should not be filled unless a qualified service technician is present to witness the first fill. An oil shutoff valve and a new oil filter should be installed at the tank. An oil safety valve is strongly recommended to prevent the tank from siphoning. It should be installed in accordance with the manufacturer's instructions. A new oil line should be run as directly as possible from the tank to the oil burner, following the piping recommendations of the fuel unit manufacturer. It's always best to use a solid line with no couplings or unions for the entire run. At the burner, the oil line should be connected to a fusible valve at the fuel pump. For most installations, 1/2 inch OD coated copper piping is preferred. At a minimum, the line must be 3/8 inch OD. Oil lines should be fastened in place to avoid accidents and damage. If copper tubing has to be buried in or will come in direct contact with concrete, it must be corrosion resistant. All copper tubing connections must be visible, accessible, and made tight with flare fittings. Compression fittings must not be used. It is not a good practice for 2 or more oil burners to share an oil line. Individual lines should be run from the tank to each burner. In some situations, the oil line is run overhead to the oil burner instead of along the floor. This may occasionally cause the fuel unit to become air-bound and lose its prime. In such installations, it's advisable to use oil de-aerators to eliminate air from the oil line before it reaches the fuel unit. When the oil truck arrives, the installer should carefully observe the tank and piping while the tank is being filled to capacity and should tell the delivery person to stop immediately if there's a problem. proper vent whistle and tank gauge operation should be verified at this time. If no deficiencies are found during the filling, the oil valve can be opened and the oil line bled. Once the air has been completely purged, the installer should verify that there are no leaks in the oil line. The burner should then be adjusted and a full efficiency test performed. At least 15 minutes after the delivery is completed, the installer must again check the tank and piping for leakage, paying particular attention to joints and fittings. There are some important differences in installation procedures and additional factors that must be considered when installing a fiberglass reinforced plastic tank outdoors. Be sure to check local regulations for specific outdoor tank installation requirements. In general, the tank must be properly secured to a cement pad that extends 6 inches beyond the edge of the tank on all sides. A tie-down is recommended for tanks installed in areas with a risk for high winds or flooding. Despite its inherent weather resistance, an FRP tank should be positioned so that it will not be subject to falling ice, snow, or dripping water. Outdoor oil lines should be insulated. Setbacks from property lines must be observed, typically 5 feet for tanks up to 275 gallons and 10 feet for tanks up to 660 gallons. Check for required setbacks from other fuel tanks. Tanks must not block building entrances or windows. If it is installed in an area exposed to vehicular traffic, the tank should be protected with bollards. A shutoff valve, a new oil filter, and an optional oil safety valve should be installed inside where the oil lines enter the building. One of the oil lines should be connected to the valve. The other should be plugged and reserved for future use, unless there are multiple oil burners, in which case individual lines should be run from the tank to each burner. Following tank installation, the work area should be thoroughly cleaned and all debris removed from the premises for proper disposal, and all tools and equipment returned to their proper places in the service truck. The customer should be advised on the importance of keeping the area around the tank clean and of keeping the path to the fill pipe clear. The installer should also explain that the tank is the customer's responsibility. It must be checked periodically, with any drips or odor being immediately reported to the oil company. After completing the necessary paperwork and giving copies to the customer, the installer should take one last look around to verify that there are no leaks or discrepancies, and that all tools, equipment, and installation debris have been removed. This video has shown the proper procedures for indoor and outdoor installation of above-ground fiberglass reinforced plastic oil tanks. Local codes and regulations must always be followed when installing oil heat equipment. If this video recommends or omits a practice that causes a violation of the codes in your area, remember that the local authority has the final say, and its regulations must be followed. But proper tank installation is just the beginning. To assure that our oil heat customers have an ample supply of safely stored fuel, all oil tanks must be visually inspected on a systematic basis, and any deficiencies corrected before they have the chance to cause problems. NORA recommends 3 levels of inspection for all customer oil tanks. An initial inspection of a tank before your company fills it for the first time, an inspection during each heating system tune-up, and a brief inspection before each oil delivery. The flexibility of providing on-site storage is one of oil heating's greatest advantages. The proper installation and maintenance of customers' oil tanks demands total commitment from everyone in our industry.